I think the problem, or there's a greater problem, which is that the way that we publish now has produced basically a scientific monoculture. That until about a generation ago, there were many different ways that people communicated their results. Some were much more akin to a newspaper or a magazine. Some were proceedings of scientific societies. Some were letters that were published. And all of these different ways of publishing serve different ends and allow people to operate with different incentives. Now we have basically one system that if you are a working academic, the way that you acquire status is by publishing in the best journal that you can publish in. And those journals are all selecting on pretty similar things. They operate in pretty similar ways. The main differences between them are just the content that they publish. And so that incentivizes everyone to basically try to do the same thing. Like every researcher's dream is to get a paper into Science or Cell or whatever, which means that we don't have people pursuing idiosyncratic incentives and doing weird things. Everyone is trying to do the same thing. And so there's all sorts of research questions that never get asked or data that never gets published because it doesn't get people into those journals. And I think this is basically, I think, a huge loss that's hard to even see because it's just something that never happens.
All right. Well, again, welcome. We're so glad everyone could join us this afternoon. It's summertime, but a great time to talk about seeking truth and the systems that make that possible, or maybe don't. We are pleased to welcome today our panelists. David Meller is Director of Policy at the Center for Open Science, which is a nonprofit organization working to increase the openness, integrity, and reproducibility of research. And he holds a PhD in ecology and evolution. Adam Mastriani is the author and editor over at an amazing Substack account called Experimental History, which you should read if you haven't already. His PhD is in psychology. And Nicole Barbero is my colleague here at Heterodox Academy, where she's communications director, but she also has an academic and research background, and her PhD is in experimental psychology. Nicole's been interested in incentives around research and academic professions for many years. So we've got a great group here. I want to talk a little bit about our format today. If you're joining us for the first time, Heterodox Academy advances the principles of open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement. We are so glad to have you here, whether you're an HXA member or a first-time visitor. We like to follow what we call the HXA way, which you can see here on the screen. And we try to do that even when we're in Zoom. So please keep that in mind. We'll also invite everybody to drop your questions in the Q&A box. Give a thumbs up to someone else's question that you think is particularly good. And we'll leave some time to get to some of those during the course of our time together this afternoon. Finally, I want to invite everyone, if you're not already, to become a member of Heterodox Academy. Membership is free and gets you involved in all kinds of our community activities, gets you access to different opportunities within the Heterodox Academy world, and helps us stay in touch. We think that universities and colleges and academia is a wonderful thing. We love it so much, we want to make it better, and we want to do that with you. So please consider becoming a member if you aren't already. And if you're not in higher ed as a professor or a student or an administrator of some kind, you can still join us in the sense of following us, subscribing, getting involved. You can join us at our brand new website at heterodoxacademy.org. If you haven't visited lately, it's almost unrecognizable, except you're going to see years worth of terrific content from our members there. All right, enough of that. Let's get into the conversation. We're here today to talk about research. And, you know, we're a beautiful modern society. We have all kinds of modern institutions, including this wonderful institution of peer review, journal publishing, which just makes sure that everything that gets published is vetted by experts and absolutely reliable and interesting at all times, except maybe not. And so I want to start out by asking a question. What are some of the shortcomings? What are some of the flaws that exist in our academic publishing systems today that might get in the way of it serving the function that we hope it will. David, I think I'll start with you. What are some of those flaws and drawbacks of the status quo today?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and for putting on this panel. So there are a couple of different ways I've thought about sort of answering this. There's one of the most sort of frequent complaints, or the frequent things that are kind of easy to point out, is that it's a 21st century system that's really being run on the bones of 19th century type of processes and workflows. But it's not that's not usually where I'll sort of emphasize some of the issues. A lot of the old processes, or a lot of the sort of fundamental ways that science should progress are just fine. But a lot of those systems that we've put in place really don't take into account some of those more idealistic workflows and processes and philosophies. We refer frequently, and it's almost universally applauded in the academic community, the so-called Mertonian norms that have been that Robert Merton published back in the 1940s, sort of talking about universal access to data so that everyone can look at the same information, being skeptical, and he refers to it as organized skepticism, really looking at evidence in a non-dogmatic way. I mean, that's very tough, but a very kind of important thing to try to set up in a structured way, and being disinterested in what the actual truth is, and not being too dogmatic with how we want to look at the theories that we have, or the evidence that we want to present, but really having that idealistic search for truth on the process. And unfortunately, we are all humans, and we have our own biases that kind of get in the way of getting through that process. So we often look at the academic publishing system. We look at the results of work once they're known to us, and so when you see something that works the way you expect it to, or doesn't work the way you didn't expect it to, those preliminary expectations really cloud your perception of what the evidence is saying or is not saying. So there are, and I'll get into it in a little bit, but there are structures and workflows and processes to really take those type of biases into account, so that we can set up really rigorous tests in ways that are fair to the perhaps both sides of different points of view, or both sides of the predictions or the theoretical expectations that could result, based on the work that's about to be done. So to summarize, I'd basically say that the systems created without some of those idealistic norms that really should be at the forefront of how we design our assessment of what evidence is saying or is not saying.
Mm-hmm. So just to make sure I'm following, so if I'm an individual researcher, maybe I have a Mertonian ideal in mind, but I also have all kinds of biases and maybe incentives that give me an interest in finding what I hope to find, that will help me get a job, that'll help my resume. And maybe you multiply that across all of academia, it starts to skew what gets published. Do I have that right?
Yeah, in fact, it's very widely seen through surveys that almost all researchers kind of subscribe to those ideals, but we can't get necessarily past them once we see our lizard brains, so to speak, get in the way. Once we start to try to critically evaluate something that contradicts what we expect it to say.
Thank you so much. So Adam, maybe I can bring you in here. You've, I think, seen some similar challenges in the in the academic research world. But I have a feeling you might go even further. So are there additional flaws that you spot as you look out at academic research today?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of a whole bizarro layer cake of things that make no sense. I mean, beginning with the money, which everyone who's in research understands how it works, but not why it works this way. So most academic research is behind a paywall, and you have to pay somewhere between like 20 and $100 if you want to get a single paper. And if you're actually doing any research, obviously a single paper is not going to be, you might have to look at hundreds of papers. And so unless you have an institutional affiliation and your institution is dropping millions of dollars every year to have access to all these journals, you just don't get to have it unless you use, and I of course would never encourage you to use, an illegal website like Sci-Hub. That is of course evil and bad. But ostensibly, if you are a law-abiding citizen, if you don't have an academic access, you just don't get to know the fruits of knowledge, which it's hard to look at that and I think not go crazy. This idea that like most of this research is funded by taxpayers, and then there's like this rent-seeking class in the middle that extracts all of the money. They don't do the work. They like provide very little additional labor that makes the work any better. And in fact, I think they often make it worse. And then they like rake in the proceeds. That part I think makes no sense. But even without that, even if we didn't have that problem, I think the problem, or there's a greater problem, which is that the way that we publish now has produced basically a scientific monoculture that until about a generation ago, there were many different ways that people communicated their results. Some are much more akin to a newspaper or a magazine. Some were proceedings of scientific societies. Some were letters that were published. And all of these different ways of publishing serve different ends and allow people to operate with different incentives. Now we have basically one system that if you are a working academic, the way that you acquire status is by publishing in the best journal that you can publish in. And those journals are all selecting on pretty similar things. They operate in pretty similar ways. The main differences between them are just the content that they publish. And so that incentivizes everyone to basically try to do the same thing. Like every researcher's dream is to get a paper into Science or Cell or whatever. Which means that we don't have people pursuing idiosyncratic incentives and doing weird things. Everyone is trying to do the same thing. And so there's all sorts of research questions that never get asked or data that never gets published because it doesn't get people into those journals. And I think this is basically, I think, a huge loss that's hard to even see because it's just something that never happens. Like these papers never get published, the ideas never get out there. The data never gets out there. And I think that is the biggest problem with the system, not the system itself, but what it prevents from existing. That I think we have a system that's optimized for certain kinds of outputs, but when you're optimized for one thing, it means you can't be optimized for other things. And so basically we have an ecosystem in which everyone is trying to be a mammal. And it's like no one's trying to be a lizard and no one's trying to be a lichen and no one's trying to be like a sea cucumber. And because of that, we have an ecosystem where a few people will survive and most people will starve, and probably the whole thing will collapse because we don't have that kind of diversity that allows the sort of vibrancy of different ideas and different approaches and different answers to questions.
Thank you. So as we think about this problem, and I guess the wide-ranging set of challenges would be more accurate, I think that ends up having pretty far-ranging consequences. Nicole, I know you've thought a lot about the academic and career implications of all this, but anything that you would add as we sort of size up some of the challenges here?
Yeah, I definitely want to emphasize the point that Adam made of like the inhibition of the actual impact of science and the public accessibility of science. That's something that I think is a major flaw, and it's something that I think more of the transparent practices and preprints and other solutions we'll get into later are working to help. And I'll just add two kind of points that I think about in terms of the major problems with the system as it is right now. Is one, I feel like it's too slow to actually advance science in the way that we need it to, especially in high stakes circumstances. So the COVID pandemic was a great example of this. And this is something I wrote about actually in a blog for HXA. There we saw researchers like bypassing the traditional publishing system to get research and data out faster so other scientists and the public could actually understand what was going on. So preprints were like the star of the show for the first 6 months. And even with like these advanced peer review and journal practices, papers were still taking more than 2 months to actually go through the process. And if we didn't have these other systems in place that allowed scientists to actually get work out, we'd be waiting 2 months to find information that could have been known 2 months sooner, which during a global pandemic is obviously very useful. So I think the system's very slow. Since then, obviously, I think every academic who's watching this will attest to how slow the peer review process has gotten in recent months, where people are waiting like sometimes years for papers to get out. So I just think the system's too slow for what we have now, and we have technology in place to make this system much more efficient and actually getting knowledge out there to both the public and other researchers. And then second, I'll just hit on the point of like publications have become so central to an academic's career, especially if you're on the tenure track at, a research-oriented university or in a research-oriented position. The idea of a publication has become so central and has created such this, kind of skewed incentive structure that the focus is just getting publications in the right journals, kind of as fast as possible. So you can get, advance through kind of the tenure track, when the goal of science should be discovery and inquiry and, solving problems and discovering new things. But the goal now is just to get publications in the best journals or the right journals for your field. So I think the publishing system has become like its own beast within academia, that's not necessarily aligned with the goals of science or scholarship more generally.
Thank you. I'm pleased to see so many comments already in the chat and in the Q&A. I'll throw an extra prompt out there in case anyone wants to take it up in the chat. So we sometimes end up with a bunch of psychologists on a panel at HXA, and that's what we've done today. If you're not in this particular part of science, whether you're in astrophysics or philosophy or music theory or law, where the students are the ones who run the journal, please chime in and let us know how this applies or might be a little different in your corner of academia. Okay, so we've talked about a really wide-ranging set of challenges that are kind of intersecting and slowing down this kind of ideal search for truth that we were hoping to have. What can be done about it? I saw one comment in the chat from one of our members saying, well, maybe there's a way to sort of pre-publish your research plans, and then maybe the results will fall as they may, but the review incentives will be a little bit better aligned. Maybe I can go back to you, David. The center where you work has done so much good work thinking about new tools to advance this. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and if I could be so bold as to use Adams, if I can use your analogy, the ecosystem, what we see in the published literature is kind of a monoculture of mammals, and the mammals that we would say that litter the ecosystem are sort of surprising, statistically significant findings. And so confirmatory research or research that presents null or negative findings is largely absent. Estimates vary, but a lot of estimates are centered around less than 5% of the literature. Doesn't support the hypothesis that the authors laid out. And what that implies is either that everyone doing all this work has perfect prediction powers to know the future, which is not likely, or that we're testing extraordinarily boring work and just can know what's going to happen, and we don't think that's happening either. But what we see a lot of is that incentive to get those statistically significant, surprising findings. There are unfortunate means to achieve that. So there's a lot of different ways to torture a data set to kind of tell it something that one thinks might be most likely to get into Cell, Nature, or Science, as was mentioned before. Just the types of journals that and this happens in many journals, of course, not to pick on the big three, but the types of results that are most surprising and would make the biggest headlines. But what you alluded to, Michael, is a process of pre-specification, sort of setting up the test ahead of time and subjecting that to peer review. And so, coming up with a good research question is the most important first step. Finding out the best way to put that to a very rigorous test is the next most important step. And that's where there are a lot of biases that can occur. If you're using a data set that you've collected after an experiment, throughout that process, it can come to all sorts of different results. And so setting that up before you see what the results are precisely going to be can be the best way to make sure that that's being put to a fair test. And bringing peer reviewers into that process it really shifts the conversation. I was monitoring some of the chat, and complaining about peer reviewers is probably what academics love to do most, me included. And it's because setting that up at the end really sets us up for critique, and critique is of course important. But if that's the only opportunity that there is for dialogue, then it becomes almost guaranteed to be an exercise in gatekeeping, finding flaws, especially if it doesn't confirm with what you expected to say. It's easy to criticize after seeing how the chips fell. So the workflow known as registered reports sort of flips it on its head. The importance of the research question and the ability of the proposed methods to address that question fairly, and setting up fair goalposts. So a lot of self-doubt or review criticism can occur. If you see null results, you could think, oh, I just didn't do it right. Reviewers will point out, oh, it just didn't work because of course you are incompetent. I wouldn't say it quite that way, but some reviewers might. But setting up those goalposts ahead of time so that we know that it's a fair test. And there can even be what's known as those adversarial collaboration, where proponents of different theories can sort of set a fair test for both of them simultaneously. And as long as those types of tests are set up before data are collected or before the data are accessed, or at least before results are known, there can be a way to overcome a lot of those types of biases. And these registered reports have been around in different formats for many years, but a big push in the last 10 years, especially among the social sciences, has started to see that publication bias has been dramatically reduced among articles that use that type of format.
Thank you. So Adam, I think I'll go back to you. I think you personally have practiced some of the open data and pre-registration. I don't know if you've done a registered report, but you've also been an advocate for some of these practices. But as for the next step of actually going out with the journal publication, you've got a different take on this. Would you share that with our audience?
Yeah, I mean, going along with this idea that we should have an ecosystem of people doing different things because each approach has its own trade-offs. And really what we want is sort of a Swiss cheese model of like, if you get enough non-overlapping trade-offs, then you get the best of each approach. What I've started doing is I post my research on my blog, and I write about it honestly, and I write about it in regular words. And by honestly, I mean like actually honestly. So the paper that I posted, I forgot why I ran study 8, and like I had a pre-registration, so I knew what analysis I was going to do, but I'd forgotten like the theoretical reason why we went from study 7 to study 8. And knowing the results now, it like makes sense. It was interesting. And as my friend and I, we were writing this up originally for publication in a journal, and I was like, how do we gloss this such that we don't say that we know, or that we remember why we did this, but we also don't not say it, because we can't just say, and we were both like, well, why don't we actually just put this on the internet and tell the truth? And so we did that, and we're like, hey, here's study 8, forgot why we ran it. If you know, please let us know. And I got dozens of people writing to me being like, here's why I think you ran study 8. It was a very life-affirming experience that like the people that I heard from were people who were actually interested in the question that I was trying to answer and wanted to help me answer it, which is not the relationship that you have with peer reviewers, who are people watching you bid for status and doing everything they can to prevent you from getting that status. A few of them, I think, actually want to help you. I think most of them are in this position, this very strong situation where it's like, I don't actually feel all that altruistic about doing this, because if you get ahead, I feel like it's a zero-sum game. So yeah, what I do and what I intend to do in the future is write in this different way, put it all in a place anyone can find it, write about it in a way anyone can understand it. All the data, the materials and code are there, thanks to the Open Science Framework website, where you can download all that stuff. And so for the 0.001% of readers who is like, I really want to know what question 7, like what the actual wording was, like that's there for them. But for everyone else who doesn't want that level of detail, you can understand what we did without also having to go through a 60-page report where that's buried somewhere, and it's impossible to actually get the gist of what we did without spending 30 minutes trying to read this paper. So that's what I do, and that's what I would be happy if more people did. But I also don't feel like I want to sit, or want anyone to sit in like the emperor's chair of science and decide how all of it should work, which I think is where a lot of these conversations tend toward, because when you ask, oops, it looks like we lost David. Hope he comes back. I hope I didn't offend him. When you ask a question like what can be done, often the way that we think is, well, what can we make everyone do? And I think that is the wrong way of approaching it, because there isn't anyone in charge. And if you actually want to change incentives or how institutions work, there's many different institutions that are all working independently, and no one person's in charge of any of them, and thank goodness. But to change those things, you really, I mean, to put it simply, you may notice the skulls of all the people who have tried to do that before you, which is why the way that I look at it is like, I am a participant in an ecosystem. What is the best thing that I can do to make that ecosystem healthier? And my answer is, well, find my niche where I feel like I'm using my talents as best as I can, and just get really good at being in that niche, and not try to stop other niches from existing. But to hope that if I'm doing my best over here and other people are doing their best over there, then together we produce something that's better.
Well, Adam, I will posit the point that you do not want to be emperor of science. However, we may have folks who are on the webinar or watching later, who run a department, who run a university, who get to direct major government grants. And today, they may be allocating scarce resources of jobs and tenure and grant dollars by reference to the existing system. Which journal did you publish in? How prestigious is that journal? What's your overall impact score, and so forth? And they might be sitting here thinking, well, like, what's the alternative? So I'm going to read everybody's Substack. Can you just describe for us like what it would look like if we weren't as focused on the traditional journal process?
Sure. I mean, I'm on one side of this right now, right, where I am looking at the possibility of applying for tenure track jobs and thinking about what it will be like to explain the values that I have and the approach that I have, and knowing that I think to a lot of people they sound crazy. And just wishing that they didn't sound so crazy, that it wouldn't sound crazy to go like, oh, actually, I communicate my science in a different way, and for people to go like, oh, that's great, because we would like to have a diversity of ways that people communicate science. Like, that seems like a very normal answer, but one that I fear is much rarer than I would like. I think similar with people who distribute the scarce resource of money. There was a Nobel laureate, I think his name was Sidney Brenner, who would go around giving this talk about the casino fund, just being like, everybody give me 1% of your money and I'll give it out randomly. And he was like, nobody likes the casino fund because it feels like, well, we need to make sure that we're giving out everything, we don't waste any money. And I think it's just not the case that we can actually look at proposals and know perfectly like how to distribute the money. And if we did, it's probably because we're asking a bunch of very obvious questions that like we know that it's going to work because it's not that interesting. And so why don't we reserve at least some of what we do for actual high risk endeavors? There are a lot of things that like claim to do this. They're like, tell us about your high risk idea, but do it in 100 pages and make sure also that it's definitely going to work, because we don't want to fund anything that doesn't work. And like, I would love if we could carve off some money and be like, this is money that we are willing to say like, this might go nowhere. But it also might go somewhere really exciting. this all comes from the way I think about science, which is as a strong link problem, which is basically that like we progress at the rate that we produce our best work. We don't progress at the rate that we prevent the worst work from happening. And a lot of the systems that we have in place are trying to prevent bad work from coming out, which I think may seem attractive in the short term, but in the long term basically doesn't matter. That like the bad ideas, the useless things die of disuse. And one way I think about this is like Newton obviously like invented mechanics and still pretty useful. A lot of that stuff's still around. Also had a recipe for a philosopher's stone. And like curiously, we don't still use the recipe for the philosopher's stone. And I don't think there was much to be gained in someone looking over Newton's shoulder being like, stop writing that, because we also might have prevented mechanics. Anyway, that's my long answer to it.
The strong link, weak link distinction. It's really interesting. So when we talked about the problem at the beginning, we were naming some of the intended functions of the current system. You know, we want to be seeking truth. We want to be, tapping into experts who know the evolving state of a field. I think maybe I'm not sure about the history here, but maybe there was another function, which was having blind or even double blind review was meant to sort of weed out the bias in some level. Nicole, do you see that as part of the mix here too? And is there a trade-off between going completely open and getting rid of that sense of having blinders on when you just look at the work?
Yeah, this one's a tricky one because I think with a lot of these solutions with like the new infrastructure and increased transparency, overall, I think it's a net positive for science and for researching and for academia overall. But there are some trade-offs that I feel like don't get brought up as much. And I think that does come with like the attempt at double blinding peer review, for example, I think was a good idea in practice, probably before everything was all over the internet and blinding isn't really that blind anymore. Because there is a status and a hierarchy in academia, whether people want to, play into it or not. But, there's a clear hierarchy of institutions and obviously academic status where you are from the graduate student level all the way up to, the distinguished professor level doing research. And when blinding goes away, which, comes along with the increased transparency, we open up the door for some of that bias to come back out. And I've experienced that myself as a graduate student researcher when I was trying to publish research that countered prevailing theories in developmental psychology that have been around for decades. And I was like, well, actually, let's try something else. Like this evidence doesn't support this, trying to come in with a little bit more of a heterodox view. And obviously, if you're challenging a big theory, they're going to send the papers to the people that have made their career on that theory. And it happened several times where it was like, oh, you're a graduate student, publishing, like, that's cute. Like, it's okay to be wrong. And I actually had an email sent to me that it's okay to be wrong as a student. And you wouldn't necessarily get those things, if double blind was effective. So it makes sense. And also if you see, the prestige bias from the universities of like, oh, these people run a big lab, like, I don't want to say anything bad about them. Or what if they find out it's me if the reviewer isn't blind? So there are those trade-offs of like the inherent kind of status and hierarchy that comes along with academia that I don't know if we've fully fixed that issue yet. Again, overall, I think the transparency is a net positive for science, but I don't know if David, I know you guys have like blinded links, at the center for things, but, especially with preprints now, you can search and find the preprints online. So I'm curious if you guys have any like solutions or if you guys are working on anything that can maybe help address that, to be honest.
Yeah. People think here at the Center for Open Science and assume, everything 100% open all the time. And that's, that can have unintended consequences, as you're mentioning. So, and we're working on this with some of our policy proposals these days of incorporating peer review transparency into our official recommendations. And what we mean by that is likely not going to include signed reviews or putting the identity of the person providing the review to that. There's not, an absolute benefit to doing that all the time because of the either real or perceived. Sometimes it doesn't matter because it can have the same effect. Fear of retribution or just harm to reputation. But getting access to the content of those reviews can be extremely valuable. How did the manuscript evolve over time? What were the criticisms? How are those criticisms addressed? And frankly, figuring out what manuscripts are rejected and for what reasons. That's very important information in the scholarly literature. And so finding ways to bring that type of information to light can be, frankly, a goldmine for scholarship and the advancement of science. But making sure that that doesn't cause some of the unintended consequences of too much transparency. There's currently good recommendations for how to make sure that shared data sets don't include identifying information. That's pretty easy. But there's also lots of ways to re-identify someone if enough pieces of information are accidentally shared. And so bringing those type of safeguards along with the transparency is what is we and many others are trying to focus on to get the important benefits of trust and credibility and verifiability into all empirical findings, or as many as possible, without those types of unintended consequences.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question as we're disambiguating what open might mean. In the Q&A, Nathan asks, some publications expect authors to pay money for open access, which can look like a vanity press, and not all authors are equally situated to afford paying money for publication. He sees that as a potential problem. I'm guessing that your center is not advancing these types of open access journals, but do you have a thought on that? And any panelists, please weigh in.
Yeah, it's somewhat unavoidable, that perception with a lot of open access journals, and the rise of predatory journals really exemplifies the problematic aspect of that. And what we're trying to advocate is to sort of focus more on, as much as possible, on the transparency of the overall research process, more so than the outlet of the publication. We evaluate journal policies based on the degree to which they follow the recommendations and the transparency and openness promotion guidelines, as an alternative to the impact factor, which is useful for some reasons, for some means, but it shouldn't be used as a proxy for how good a journal is or how good individual research articles are in which they're published. Generally, we're trying to solve that problem that Nathan mentioned in the chat. There's no perfect solution, and we think preprints are probably the main important solution to that. It quickly, Nicole, as you mentioned, it speeds up the dissemination of early research findings. It provides a venue for accessing work regardless of the business model that was used to publish it. And one thing I really like about preprints is that a lot of people, especially in the news media, are trained to look at them with a little bit of skepticism. So oftentimes, and this came up a lot in the pandemic, an early research finding that hasn't yet been peer reviewed is being treated with an appropriate amount of skepticism. Frankly, we think that that same amount of skepticism should be applied to any research that hasn't been replicated or hasn't been confirmed through sort of independent steps. Oftentimes we take peer review as a golden mark of approval that can iron out all sins, and we know that that's not true. It's being sometimes it's for lots of reasons that I think the panel knows. Sometimes it's rushed, sometimes it's biased. It's, I think, like Winston Churchill said, it's democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. Peer review is the best way to sort of disseminate some research findings, except for all of its flaws. But all sorts of research findings should be treated with that same type of skepticism that preprints are. And we know that there's been a lot of scholarship on preprints over the past few years. And the credibility and rigor of work that goes into preprints is about on par with work that ends up in the final published literature. So the fact that they're treated with skepticism is a good thing, and I would translate that type of skepticism more broadly.
Well, I think there may be an opportunity to shift sort of where in the process the journal and the journal editor comes in. And I take the registered report concept to be sort of moving it earlier in the process before the results come out. Adam, I think you might be an advocate for maybe getting rid of it altogether. Okay, you're not advocating, but in your career, you're not going to engage with them in that way. Could it also move to the end of the process, sort of after publication altogether? I mean, we don't literally need these journals to disseminate. We have the internet. We don't need to print and mail things. They're not hard to find. Could they evolve into sort of awards associations, like the people who give out the Grammys, and we all look at the scholarship, and then you still have to, you can give out the status that everyone needs? Or am I a non-academic and just crazy? Adam, what do you think?
Yeah, I can jump in there. I think so. So there's this this law from game theory called Goodhart's law that a lot of people are probably familiar with, but if you're not, just the idea that once a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a useful measure because now everyone is just trying to game the system. And so like a good example of this is like the US News and World Report college rankings, where my very recent employer, Columbia, just like doctored their numbers to increase their standing. And the problem, the thing about Goodhart's law is, as far as I know, we don't have an antidote to it. This just appears to be how the world works. Like you can do a better or worse job of aligning people's incentives with the way that you actually want them to act. But there's always some gap between those things. And so I think even if you put the incentives at the end, then I think you still incentivize people to publish papers in such a way that like, I know, like I get some sense of how to create the thing that eventually science is going to stamp with its approval stamp on it. I was reading an article a while back about the campaigns that movies do to get Academy Awards, and of like the places that they put billboards so that the right people see them. And you might just think that like, well, we just make movies and then they vote on which ones are best. And like, no, the ones that win are the ones that like play this very canny game of making sure the right people see the right movies at the right time and think about them in the right way and have the right narrative for why that movie is a good movie. And I think we would see the same with science, which is why I think we shouldn't try to incentive engineer ourselves or fool ourselves into thinking that we can incentive engineer ourselves out of the situation. I think the only solution is to have competing incentives that other people are abiding by. And so if something is published by someone who's under the incentive of, I need to get this in the best journal possible, I also want someone working on that question who's under the incentive of, I win when a lot of people like read my stuff. And then someone else who has the incentive of, I just have a grant that lets me live for 5 years and I can do whatever I want. And like, I think it's a good use of my time to like, check this thing and see if it works or work on this problem. And if they all end up at the same answer, then we can be pretty certain that it's true. And maybe that's important because it's attracted people who had different reasons of doing research in the first place. That'd be my answer.
Yeah.
And I think that gets at a bigger point too of the centrality of publications in academic careers. So like you don't really, as of right now, our system's not set up great for people that just want to do, kind of more exploratory research because everything is tied to publications, like your career advancement, your funding opportunities, your lab, your trainees, like everything gets tied to funding. And centrally, all that funding's tied back to publications when it comes to it. So I think if we can, I think all the changes, innovations we've done to like the peer review process and like research publishing, we also need to think about the systems that also support it, like our funding models, like our federal funding models, like the NIH and NSF, which are the two big ones. We need to think about how those models change, how our hiring committees change, our training programs change and adapt. So I think I like the idea, Adam, of like the competing incentives. And I think that would be probably the best solution for that. But we need to also like decouple publications from being like the top goal of doing an academic career. Because then we're left with folks that don't want to necessarily play that game, end up leaving out of the traditional track. So we're just leaving, folks that, can play that game better or have the resources and opportunities to play that game better. So we need to make sure that we can keep people in the academic system with kind of taking different approaches to research and publishing too.
Fantastic. So I want to move to getting in some questions and comments from the chat. In the spirit of improving systems, I'm going to try something new. I'm going to share some questions and comments and briefly pause. If any of our panelists would like to jump in, feel free. If not, I'll keep going, because the worst that can happen is more of the insightful comments from our audience get incorporated into our recording. So I'll share one. We had a commenter say that there's here's a question. Why not have papers that are published in a rough form and reviewed by readers who are actually interested in the results, and have their comments be used to modify the paper over time? Then those most interested can subscribe to be notified of changes. It just seems lame how we currently do things as if we don't have the internet and it's 1970. Even I wasn't around in 1970, as old as I feel sometimes. But thank you. That was anonymous.
I think that has to do with more of like the open peer review process. I'm not sure. I haven't actually used it myself, but I think there's like an open peer review process for that. I'm not sure if you can subscribe to the results, but that'd be a nifty feature if anyone's listening who's involved in building that process. But I think the like preprint open peer review process could be helpful for sure.
Paul asks, is it fair to ask for the public's trust in science and research institutions, given our own dissatisfaction and issues raised like the NeurIPS experiment, which I'm not familiar with, but I do think that we shouldn't forget how many non-scientists and researchers are impacted by various versions of you should trust the science. So this does seem to be a topic of really public concern.
Yeah, I agreed with what David said about applying the same skepticism that you have to preprints to other things. And I think skepticism is the right word. That like skepticism is actually different from distrust, because skepticism is different from suspicion. And I think we deserve skepticism. That like the way that you earn trust is by being able to show people that you have evidence for your claims. And I think it is warranted that people are skeptical of claims that don't have sufficient evidence. And when we ask people to just trust us, then I mean, we're basically asking what a priest does. Is like, well, I can't prove to you that any of this is true, and the whole point is for you to believe. And I think the point of what we do is that we don't operate that way. We provide evidence for our claims, and we expect to be trusted in proportion to the evidence that we provide. And so I think you can be much more skeptical of science without being suspicious of it in the same way.
And I think the transparency will help with that, and having the because we need the public to trust our science, because they fund a lot of science. We don't want science funding to keep getting cut from the federal level. Like, we need public to also trust that we're doing good things. But I think the transparency and accessibility of science, so people can actually read and see what's going on and people can dig into things, I think that will go a long way for helping.
Yeah, and going along with that, both of those points, being comfortable with the amount of ambiguity there is, and seeing, unfortunately, not unfortunately, well, a little bit unfortunately, the messy process by which science is trying to tackle these types of questions and increase credibility and trust through transparency, and use skepticism in the healthiest way.
I will also mention, just as a sign of progress, Christopher in the chat says things have gotten a bit better about null results in psychology with the open science movement. Almost all my career is null results. It was a worse slog 20 years ago than now by far. He says he does media effects research. Turns out it doesn't have a lot of effects. Well, maybe that's also hopeful for those of us who watch too much media. Thank you, Christopher. I wanted to ask another anonymous question from an anonymous member here. How might generative AI be useful to the publication process, peer review work, and editorial work. And if I can just suggest a possible angle, I mean, I think there's been some work done on at least machine learning as trying to predict which papers will replicate. Do you know anything about that, David or Adam or Nicole?
Yeah, there are a number of projects. We're involved with one called SCORE. We're trying to systemize the sort of how credible different types of empirical evidence are by looking for signals amongst that evidence. So things like what the study design was, sample size, what the statistical inference metrics applied to it, and it's messy. It's just messy. There are prediction markets that have good success. It's AI has a huge role to play, but it's going to be messy for the next couple of years as folks figure out what exactly it's useful for and where the pitfalls are going to be.
One thing I'll say on that is so many of the tools that we have and that we're developing help us answer the question of whether something is true. And I think that's actually the second question that we should ask of any research output. And the first is, would it matter if it were true? And that one is much more difficult to answer because it's very subjective and people can disagree on it. But it is something that you have to have an intuition about before you go to the trouble of finding out whether something is true. And I think a lot of the efforts that we put into replication, I think, put that second question first, that something is important if it is true. And I think many things are trivially true. And I think I'm a social psychologist. And in fact, I think there are many true things we've discovered that don't matter. And we could have set the research money on fire instead. That would have been fine. And I think we have this model of science that we're building a brick wall and everything is built on everything else. I think actually, I mean, I only speak for my field in this way, but many things are nothing gets built on them. They're just bricks sitting out in a field alone. And as time goes by, they turn into dust. And so yeah, it would be good if every brick was a true brick. But for the ones on which nothing ever comes of them, it doesn't actually matter. And I don't see a future in which a generative model can do a good job doing that, because I think I don't know what the training data is for that. That I think that problem is still too intuitive. But maybe I'll be surprised in 3 years, as most people are most of the time.
Yeah. So I think there are some statistics to back that up in terms of how many studies are never cited again or never cited by anyone other than the author. The opposite can also be a problem, I think, in that sometimes the question is so important that the process gets skewed. We have a question in the chat from Christopher who says, what does the panel think about bad retractions? The issue of papers being retracted because their results or arguments run contrary to current socio-political narratives. Is this going to lead to more newer journal approaches like the Open Journal of Open Inquiry and the behavioral sciences that are evolved to resist politicized pressure? And I think many of us may be aware of some cases like this, but panelists, do you have any thoughts on how the jolt of polarization ends up interacting with all of these systems?
My thought on those retractions is typically if you read the retractions, it's because of some methodological issue or something that was found. And I think, that's typically what the reasoning is oh, we went back and double checked and redid the review, and more careful analysis shows there's something flawed with the paper, which may or may not be true depending on each study. But I think that it's more of a signal that the process itself that we have currently isn't actually good at detecting a lot of the methodological issues with papers. Is I feel we only do that double check and backtracking when there's a charged paper for some reason. But I think if we did that with all the papers in an issue or a volume for a year, probably many of them that, as Adam said, maybe the results really don't matter that much, they're not political, would probably also have some of the same issues with it. So I think it's, in my view, largely a signal that we need to improve the actual process. And again, transparent practices, figuring out how we actually review things, being able to check things. I think it's just a symptom of our poor overall system rather than necessarily just obviously the politics of it. But that's my thought on those issues.
David or Adam, we've got time for about one more comment. Do you feel like weighing in on that or any other question before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think Nicole. Yeah, I think I would probably. Yeah, Nicole's gut instinct seems about right too. Those, there's probably a little bit more awareness given to some folks' work because of some controversy, and that's what kind of leads to uncovering, issues or troubles that could quite feasibly be, occur at a base rate that's currently not detected.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well,
it's funny to think of what a.
Go ahead, Adam.
Sorry, I was just gonna say it's funny to think of what a retraction means, because it makes you think, what does a publication mean? And like, it certainly doesn't mean that like the journal believes that this is true or that like this has been thoroughly vetted. Like, those things don't usually happen. It means that like an editor thought this was transmitting to the readers of this journal, and maybe 2 out of 3 reviewers agreed. And so like the retraction actually is a little more meaningful, because it means like, oh, we've actually taken a look at this now and realized that we no longer want to transmit it to people. Whereas the first time around, it was kind of like, wow, this is it passes our basic thresholds, and so we're going to send it out to our mailing list. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for the stimulating discussion. I think a lot of our audience members will take this in different ways. I want to leave a couple of minutes here at the end of our time to give everyone a chance to plug your work. And so, David, where can folks find your work on this issue or any other academic work you'd like to share?
Maybe I'll put into the chat there my LinkedIn profile if you want to see where I kind of update regularly. But most of what we advocate for is on our website, cos.io. That's where our mission to increase transparency in science. We try to take a holistic approach to build tools to enable open science. We advocate for policies that recognize and reward those, and we try to connect and bring recognition in communities of folks who are taking those first steps towards a little bit more reproducible research practices. So I'll just point folks to cos.io.
Wonderful, thank you. Adam, where can we find your work?
You can find it on my Substack, which is Experimental History. Yep, it's right there. And that's my Twitter. Thank you, Christine. That's where I put all of my research. Yeah, that's where you find me.
Excellent. And Nicole, where can we find you?
My main place these days is on my Substack as well, which isn't necessarily science related, but it's science book related. So I review various science books. So if you're interested in, learning about what cool books are out there, you can read my stuff there. And then also my Twitter handle, Christine dropped in the chat too. And I'll just add to the chat a couple blogs that I wrote on this topic as well, if folks are interested in reading those.
And Nicole, what's the name of that Substack, please?
Oh, it's called bookmarkedreads.substack.com.
Got it. All right. One more time, I want to thank our panelists and thank all of you who have joined us, whether you're with us live or are watching this recording sometime later. Please do consider joining us as a member of Heterodox Academy. We'd love to have you if you work in higher education, and we'd love to meet you even if you don't. And so we're always online at heterodoxacademy.org. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. We will see you at our next virtual event. Take care.